Our guest today has spent her life listening to the wild, especially to the voices that are most often silenced. Camilla Fox is a pioneer of compassionate conservation, working to protect native carnivores and to show us that coexistence isn't a theory, it's a responsibility. This episode is about truth, the wild, unfiltered kind. It's about our desperate need for coexistence and the cost of misunderstanding the creatures who share this planet with us. But it's also about hope. About the people fighting on the front lines to protect the wild, to heal what's been broken, and to remind us what's still worth saving. Welcome to The Wild Edge, a mission-driven podcast exploring the pulse between humanity and nature, and the stories that reconnect us to the awe of our wildlife, and the lands all of us call home. Camilla, thank you so much for agreeing to be part of our podcast.
Thank you for having me. Excited for the conversation.
You are very welcome. Stacy James, how are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. I am back in Kansas and enjoying the wildlands. Camilla, where are you right now? Where are you located?
I'm in Marin County, just north of San Francisco.
Oh, nice.
Beautiful Marin.
Beautiful.
Yeah, little Marin bubble, as we call it. And I love when I, go deal with the horrors of how we treat wildlife out of Marin, out of California. I love coming back to my beautiful county here.
Well, Fairlie wishes she was in Marin with you. But on a wildlife advocacy note, like, how important is it to be able to spend some time in a place that regenerates and rejuvenates you and your spirit so that you can go out and do the hard work that you do? Because on a daily basis, you're seeing things and hearing about things that are horrific and challenging to the human spirit. And yeah, so that's great that you're in a place that replenishes you.
Critically important. We were just talking with our staff about compassion fatigue and burnout and how common that is in this movement. And I try to encourage all of our staff to find whatever ways they need to go and rejuvenate their souls. And for me, it's definitely wild nature. And I'm very blessed to live in a place where there's lots of beauty, lots of trails. My dog and me go out every day and take a little walk, and that just replenishes. But sometimes I go into deep wild nature and need that on a sustainable, regular basis to keep doing this work.
Yeah, absolutely.
When did you start Project Coyote? And, I guess, why did you start it? What did you see as the need that you could help change?
So I founded Project Coyote in 2008, and I had worked both in the animal and environmental protection movements my entire life. I grew up just really loving all animals. I loved insects in particular, but all animals. And I have a father who studied canine ethology, wolves, coyotes, foxes, domestic dogs, the Indian dhole. He did his graduate research on. And so I was always surrounded by canines. And then my mother did cat rescue. So just from a young age, I was very lucky to have parents who instilled in me an appreciation for all beings and compassion and empathy for all sentient life. And I knew from a young age that I really just wanted to protect animals. And even in high school, I went to public high school in Maine. I challenged the dissection that they were requiring in high school. And that was sort of my first foray into advocacy. And that sort of paved the way for others who didn't want to dissect animals. And then at Boston University in college, I co-founded the Students for the Ethical Treatment of Animals with a dear friend. And I really sort of had my vision there that my career path was to protect the earth and animals. And shortly thereafter, I moved out to California and got involved in both animal protection, environmental protection, worked for Humane Farming Association, the Fur Bear Defenders, and then Rainforest Action Network, where I really got my chops in advocacy and campaign work. And then fast forward to 10 years at the Animal Protection Institute, when I started working on particularly coyote issues, wild carnivore issues. And it was then that I really saw a need and a niche for an organization that would advocate on behalf of North America's most persecuted misunderstood, maligned wild carnivores. And at that time, I personally decided to go back to grad school, got a graduate degree in wildlife ecology, policy, and conservation. And it was during that time that I formulated the idea to start Project Coyote. And in fact, some of my grad school committee members became our founding science advisory board members, and many of them are still with us today. So that was now 16 years ago that I started Project Coyote, and we've grown across the country and really have a fantastic, passionate, dedicated team. And we continue to expand our tentacles across the country.
Can we talk a little bit about coyotes, your feelings towards coyotes, and why people should, not only just accept them in the ecosystem because they're incredibly important, but also if you're going to live in areas where animals like that are, because you want to live in those beautiful places, then we have to make those exceptions and we have to learn to live with these animals and not persecute them because they come into our backyards. What is it that drew you to specifically coyotes?
Well, I think I saw my first coyote in Joshua Tree when I had moved out to California. And it was actually a coyote that was a bit habituated, meaning that it had probably, he or she had been fed by people hanging out at a visitor center. And I had a chance to just watch that coyote for, I would say, upwards of an hour or more. And I was just so intrigued by the animal, the intelligence, the wariness. And that was way back before working for an Animal Protection Institute. And I came to learn that this animal is not only ubiquitous in so many rural and urban areas, but really our most persecuted carnivore in North America. One that, despite the fact that we have been waging war against coyotes since really we stepped foot on this continent, they still persist and they still thrive even in the most harsh environments. And of course, as you mentioned, even in the busiest, densely populated cities. So in starting Project Coyote, the reason why I chose the coyote as our flagship or icon species is because I really believe that if we can shift the way we view and treat coyotes, we can shift the way we view and treat all wild animals. Because they are, I think, one of the most difficult in terms of public perception, real or perceived conflicts in, agricultural arenas and urban areas. And also, they're often the most or the first predator that anyone encounters, particularly in urban areas. Many people have never, seen or experienced a predator before. And so all of a sudden, people who move to urban areas encounter this animal and understandably often have some visceral fear. And so that's one of the reasons why we really focus on coyotes is recognizing that we do need public education to teach people that they're not a huge threat. Yes, they can cause conflicts, but there are ways to mitigate those conflicts. That they also play a really important ecological role. People don't recognize often that they are natural rodent controllers, and one coyote can consume upwards of 1,800 rodents in a year. So, we use that example as, you don't need rodenticides, deadly rodenticides that have a big impact on the ecosystem and other species. So there are all these different facets of coyotes that I think is something that's wondrous. And I think we've attracted people who sort of understand what a uniquely special animal this is. When you look at Native American lore and stories and myths, there are so many stories about the many different characteristics and facets of coyotes, from their trickster nature. Many tribes revere them as their ancestor. So pulling all that together was part of our process of making coyote our flagship species for Project Coyote. And we have lots of programs, lots of campaigns around coexistence. We work with cities and counties throughout the U.S., showing people how they can coexist, how they can mitigate conflicts. But it's challenging, particularly in agricultural areas where they have been vilified, killed in mass numbers. As I mentioned, we estimate at least one coyote every year in the US alone is killed by government agencies, ranchers, individuals. Down in Southern California, private contractors are hired at taxpayer expense to kill them, generally with snares. They're often gassed with CO2 chambers, just horribly cruel methods that in the big picture, when you step back, are not effective either. And we know this through science and decades of science that the ways that we've been killing coyotes and other wild animals are not only ethically unjustifiable, but also simply not effective.
Camilla, do you know approximately any idea how much federal money is spent, like taxpayer money is spent killing coyotes?
Yeah, so there's an agency called the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Wildlife Services, euphemistically called Wildlife Services. They used to be called Animal Damage Control, and then realized that name was not helping them. So they hired a very expensive PR firm and changed all their terminology that included their name. And so this agency kills approximately, this last year, I think it was almost 1.5 million animals at taxpayer expense, and to the tune of more than 100 million taxpayer dollars every year. So that's just one agency. That's our federal agency. Again, most people have never heard of it. USDA Wildlife Services, they sometimes confuse it with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And this agency has been in existence since the early 1900s, when the federal government basically passed the Animal Damage Control Act and allowed for taxpayer dollars to go towards killing native wildlife. And I want to mention that that's often done at the behest of ranchers and farmers to ostensibly reduce conflicts. But again, this is an agency that relies on incredibly inhumane, indiscriminate tools. They still, to this day, they rely on leg hold traps, snares, aerial gunning, poisons.
What types of animals? So 1.5 million animals approximately killed annually in the name of damage control. What types of animals would that be?
So in the carnivore suite, coyotes are the most targeted by far, but the other targeted animals include wolves, bears, bobcats, foxes, beaver, crow, a variety of animals that, or birds, I should say, that are considered threats in agricultural areas. Those are often poisoned with a horrible poison called DRC 1339. So a whole host of animals. I mean, almost every native wild animal in this country is targeted by this agency, but there are certain ones that are heavily targeted, like coyotes, predators, the ones, again, that are deemed a threat, particularly by ranchers and farmers.
And I got to wonder, too, how many taxpayers in this country realize that, where their money's going?
Very few. And that's where the education is absolutely critical. And then reform efforts. And I can talk a little bit about what we do for reform. But prior to starting Project Coyote in Marin County, we learned that Marin, along with Sonoma and Mendocino counties, were going to be testing grounds for a very deadly poison called compound 1080. And this was a poison that was used in Nazi Germany as a rodenticide. It was deemed effective to control carnivores, particularly coyotes. So that federal agency, then called Animal Damage Control, started using 1080 specifically to target predators. At that time, what they would do is lace a carcass, a cow or a sheep, with this 1080 and literally put it out on the range. Any animal that came in and consumed that carcass would die. So we would see imperiled species consuming and their populations depleting, bald eagles. Finally, the government, and actually under the Nixon administration, realized that this was incredibly detrimental to wildlife and lots of non-target animals. So the Nixon administration banned 1080, and then the agricultural lobby put pressure on the Reagan administration, legalized 1080 to be used in something called a livestock protection collar, where these collars are put on sacrificial lambs, goats, the idea being that any predator that attacks that animal will burst the poison pouches and then die. But the science showed that it takes upwards of 13 hours for a coyote to succumb to that poison. So incredibly cruel. Coming back to Marin and Sonoma Mendocino, we were going to be testing grounds for those livestock protection collars. We formed a local coalition of organizations to try to ban that poison. It led to a lot of research about what was going on in our county. And what we learned was not only were these collars being used, but snares, leg hold traps, other types of poisons being used to kill our native bobcats, foxes, coyotes, whole variety of species. Again, largely at the behest of ranchers and farmers in these North Bay counties. What we did was we brought that information to our county board of supervisors, and we quickly learned that most of them had never heard of this agency, nor were they aware of the methods being employed in our own backyard. And we found a couple of champions within those supervisors who said, is there a better way? Can we offer something for our ranchers and farmers that doesn't involve this indiscriminate, cruel killing? And so part of what I did was I worked with our Department of Agriculture, and I was actually getting my master's thesis at the time, and decided to do a comparative analysis of the previous program under Wildlife Services, the lethal program, and benchmarked it, did a comparative analysis with our non-lethal program. And this was, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but our supervisors finally decided in the year 2000 to end the contract with Wildlife Services, adopt a non-lethal program. And that program essentially took the money that paid a federal trapper and put it into a non-lethal program to assist ranchers with implementation of non-lethal methods.
So can I just jump in and ask you what the non-lethal methods are?
Absolutely. Better fencing, corrals for farm animals, so bringing them in at night because they're most vulnerable, when they're born and they're left out on the range. Various techniques called fox lights, where it's a motion-activated light that scares predators. Flattery, which is a practice that was used in Eastern Europe as a method to deter wolves from preying on livestock. So many methods that actually, have historical roots in South America and Europe that are being brought back because they're so effective, and they're often cheaper and easier to use.
I saw a film that Patagonia, I think, did. It was called Range Rider, and it was a short 10-minute film. And working, right, as these guys that, some cattlemen are hiring. They're called the range riders, and they go out on horseback, and that is their job. 24/7, and they rotate, is they just ride the fence lines. Any hint of carnivores, they don't want that conflict with humans, so they take off. And it's working. The biggest complaint from your Cattlemen's Association was that it's an extra cost that they don't need. I saw this in a film that you did, Camilla, and I stole this, and I have used this a lot. I can't remember the woman, but she had big sheepdogs that were protecting, ranchers. And she said, it's not about how we coexist. It's, are we willing to coexist?
Absolutely. I think, coexistence requires tolerance and acceptance. I think this whole program that the federal government has been subsidizing for so long has essentially ensured that ranchers are dependent on this program for, conflict mitigation. Again, because it's tax subsidized. And what we've seen is the methods you mentioned, the range riders, the livestock guard animals that includes dogs and llamas and donkeys. Those have never been subsidized by the federal government or any agencies. So ranchers have been reliant on this program that has emphasized the lethal and indiscriminate tools. When you're brought up generationally just dependent on this form of subsidy, it's hard to make that shift. And that shift also needs to come from our government agencies. They need, as we did in Marin, we shifted that paradigm. We said, instead of using that money to pay a federal trapper to underwrite the indiscriminate tools that he uses out in the field, let's apply that towards an innovative, non-lethal program that supports the ranchers, but instead using these more future humane tools. And again, some of those are, old tools like the livestock guard animals. The llamas come from South America. The livestock guard dogs were used for centuries in Eastern Europe. And so it's bringing back some of these methodologies that we've known shepherding, the range riders, we've known are effective, but that haven't been subsidized by our agents. So we're starting to see a shift with that. I will share that, we have a good working coalition of organizations. We're trying to reform this agency and propel them to shift away from the dependence on the lethal and indiscriminate tools and start to support ranchers and farmers with these non-lethal methods. So there is movement there. It's just, it's taken decades of coalition build, sometimes litigation. And for us, working with the individual ranchers, which I think is absolutely fundamentally critical, to show them that there is an alternative way. But we need more support from our, federal and state agencies to really propel that systemic reform.
That's the end of part 1 of our conversation with Camilla Fox. Part 2 will be coming along shortly. So thanks for joining us. Stacy, thank you. Camilla, thank you. And we will see you on the next one. Coexistence isn't some faraway dream. It's happening right here, right often just beyond our fences or under the same sky that we're sleeping beneath. Truth is, our wildlife, our animal neighbors are still out there trying to live their lives, raise their young, and survive in this shrinking space we all share. They don't need our fear. They need our understanding. They need space, respect, and a voice. Wherever you live, whether it's a city block, a desert canyon, or the edge of a forest, look around, listen, learn who your wild neighbors are, and do one small thing this week to protect them. Because when we protect wildlife, we're also protecting ourselves. The air we breathe, the water we drink, and the wildness that keeps our hearts beating. I'm Fairlie, and thanks for listening to On the Wild Edge. Also want to shout out, thank you Stacy James from Dazzle Africa for joining me on this episode. If this story moved you, share it. And join us in protecting our wildlife, our wild spaces, and the fragile balance that makes this planet home. See you on the next one.